Music Hall in a Rockette Spectacular. Here is Ginger Rogers, still going strong after 50 years. How come you can go do something like this? Haven't you had it yet?
Well, challenges, my goodness. It's such fun to have challenges.
What is the show? What are you doing this night?
Well, I do, of course, a little spot. I've been doing the Ginger Rogers show all over the...
There are names in Hollywood that shimmer forever. Names that never seem to age, even when time has long buried their voices. Ginger Rogers is one of those names. To the world, she was the golden girl of rhythm, the woman who danced backward in heels, who smiled beneath chandeliers, and who embodied the glittering magic of 1930s cinema. But behind every twirl and turn, behind every dazzling gown and soft focus close-up, there was a haunting silence, a silence that whispered of loneliness, control, exhaustion, and a longing for something beyond applause. Ginger Rogers was not just a dancer or an actress. She was a phenomenon, a defiant force of elegance and precision in a world that often demanded perfection without compassion. Her partnership with Fred Astaire became legend, the kind of alchemy that defied imitation. Together, they glided across sound stages like dreams materialized in silk. But few ever wondered what it cost her, the endless rehearsals until her feet bled, the quiet tears hidden behind dressing room doors, and the persistent fear that without the dance, she would vanish into irrelevance. In the glowing world of MGM and RKO, where stars were built and broken by studio contracts, Ginger Rogers was shaped not by comfort, but by survival. She knew what it meant to be poor, to be dismissed, to be told no by men who believed glamour was their creation, not hers. Yet she fought. Every frame of her filmography is a battle disguised as grace, a war fought with lipstick and lace, with wit and witless men. But as with every Hollywood fairy tale, the light was only half the story. Beneath the sequins and orchestras was a woman who suffered from the very myth she helped create. She became an icon of independence, yet off-screen she struggled to find lasting love. She became the symbol of joy, yet often retreated into isolation, afraid that the world had only ever loved her reflection, not the woman beneath. Her story is not just one of fame, it's one of disillusionment. How does a woman who once embodied perfection survive when perfection fades? How does someone who danced through the Great Depression, through world wars and shifting decades, reconcile with the silence of an empty stage? Ginger Rogers' tragedy lies not in failure, but in the slow, aching erosion of purpose, a decay not of body, but of identity. This documentary is not merely a recounting of her career. It is a journey through the emotional aftermath of a life that burned too brightly. It asks, what becomes of the woman who outdanced her pain, who made the world believe in grace while quietly drowning in exhaustion? The world adored her, but love, applause, and legacy have their limits. Ginger Rogers' name will forever glisten on the marquee of history, but her soul remains somewhere between rhythm and regret, caught in the echo of music that never truly stopped playing inside her.
Early life and family background. A dance born from survival. Before the satin gowns, before the sound of applause echoed through vast studio halls, there was Virginia Catherine McMath, a child of broken beginnings. She was born on July 16, 1911, in Independence, Missouri, a place whose name would seem like prophecy, though independence for her would never come without cost. Her father, William McMath, was a man whose instability teetered between affection and obsession. And when her parents' marriage collapsed, he kidnapped young Virginia, an act that left scars deeper than the courts could ever heal. Her mother, Leela Owens McMath, a fiercely intelligent woman with the soul of a fighter, reclaimed her daughter and vowed never again to let the world dictate their fate. From that moment, it was Ginger and Leela against the world, mother and child bound by ambition and necessity. They traveled from place to place, often chasing survival more than dreams. Poverty hung in the air like dust, invisible, inescapable. Leela took whatever work she could find, and Ginger watched her mother transform hardship into fuel. The little girl learned early that the world had no sympathy for softness. When her mother remarried and Ginger took the surname Rogers, she began to fashion her own identity from the fragments of others' expectations. There was no childhood of fairy tales for her. The laughter that would later enchant millions was born from the quiet ache of a girl who had to grow up too soon. Leela's relentless drive to protect and promote her daughter blurred into obsession. She wasn't just a mother, she was the architect of Ginger's destiny. And though Ginger would later owe her success to that determination, she would also inherit the loneliness that comes from being molded, not nurtured. In the dusty corners of Oklahoma and Texas theaters, Ginger found her first escape: movement. Dancing wasn't yet art, it was survival, a way to silence the noise of instability. When music played, she felt free, unburdened by her fractured family or her mother's towering ambitions. Every tap, every turn, every heartbeat against the rhythm was a declaration, "I am still here." But underneath that defiance, a quieter truth brewed, that every ounce of grace she learned came from pain. Every smile was armor. Every dance was an act of rebellion against the chaos that created her. The world would one day call her radiant, but those who truly looked closely would see that her light had been born from fire. As she grew older, her mother became a playwright and eventually worked for Hollywood's RKO studios, not just to build a career, but to build a fortress for her daughter. Together, they stepped into the world of performance as though walking into destiny. But the foundation of Ginger Rogers' life, her drive, her resilience, her perfectionism, was not sculpted on studio lots. It was forged in the unstable, trembling ground of her childhood. The dance was never merely movement. It was memory rewritten.
First steps, struggles. The stage was her sanctuary and her prism. By her teenage years, Ginger Rogers was already a performer. Not because she dreamed of fame, but because the stage had become the only place where she could breathe. She entered and won a Texas dance contest, and that small triumph opened the door to touring vaudeville shows. On stage, she dazzled, her timing impeccable, her energy infectious. Off stage, she was lonely, homesick, and burdened with the knowledge that every step forward came at a personal cost. In those early years, Hollywood was an unforgiving beast. It didn't nurture, it devoured. Ginger arrived with her mother by her side, clutching scripts and ambition, surrounded by faces that saw youth as currency. The auditions were endless, the rejections constant. Casting directors dismissed her as too wholesome one day and too clever the next. But Leela pushed harder, and Ginger, already hardened by her turbulent childhood, refused to break. Her first film appearances were small, fleeting, a smile here, a song there. Yet she carried something most couldn't fake, an unspoken sadness beneath her joy. Audiences couldn't name it, but they felt it. When she danced, they sensed both triumph and tragedy. and that tension, that contradiction, became her signature. Still, the early years were filled with humiliations she never forgot. She endured patronizing producers, grueling rehearsals, and the constant reminder that she was replaceable. She wasn't born into privilege. She had to build her reputation brick by painful brick. At times, she wanted to stop, to walk away from the cold artificiality of Hollywood's smiles, but she couldn't. Dancing had become her language, and to stop was to silence herself. When she finally landed a part in Girl Crazy on Broadway in 1930, her energy caught the eye of critics and audiences alike. Soon after, she transitioned to film, a risky move at the dawn of talkies. The world of sound cinema was unpredictable, yet Ginger's voice carried both warmth and wit. She was no longer the little girl who ran from her father's shadow. She was a woman commanding the gaze of millions. But even as opportunity began to bloom, there was something fragile beneath her confidence. Hollywood wanted her to be perfect, to smile on cue, to sparkle endlessly. But Ginger had known too much struggle to truly trust success. Every time the cameras rolled, she wondered how long it would last. She danced not for fame, but for control, to prove to herself that she could turn pain into art. Yet every pirouette carried the echo of a frightened child who once danced to drown out her fears. Those early struggles did not just build her career, they etched themselves into her very soul. They made her resilient, yes, but they also left her perpetually restless. The curtain would soon rise on a partnership that would immortalize her. But for Ginger Rogers, the spotlight was already a paradox, both her sanctuary and her prison.
Breakthrough moment. The dance that changed everything. There are moments in every legend's life when fate quietly shifts, when the rhythm of destiny aligns with the heartbeat of possibility. For Ginger Rogers, that moment came not with fanfare or prophecy, but with the simple sound of music and the entrance of a man whose footsteps would forever intertwine with hers on the marble floor of cinematic history. Fred Astaire. When Ginger first met Fred, the world did not yet know it was witnessing the birth of one of Hollywood's most iconic duos. She was vibrant, sharp-tongued, and radiantly alive, a woman who carried both elegance and defiance in every gesture. Fred, meticulous and self-contained, was her opposite in temperament, but her equal in brilliance. Together, they would make movement itself poetic. Their first collaboration, Flying Down to Rio, 1933, wasn't intended to change the course of cinema. They weren't even the film's stars. But then, that dance. The audience saw something new, something transcendent. As they moved, they didn't just dance, they spoke. Through glances, through rhythm, through that impossible chemistry that no script could manufacture. It was as if their souls recognized each other mid-step. When the movie ended, the audience didn't remember the plot. They remembered the girl who danced backward in heels and smiled through gravity. They remembered Ginger Rogers. Overnight, she was no longer just a promising actress. She was the woman who made Fred Astaire look even better. And though that phrase carried a sting, Ginger knew its irony. That her strength was her grace, her rebellion, her restraint. She wasn't a shadow to Fred. She was the flame that made his silhouette glow. As the 1930s unfolded, the Astaire-Rogers partnership became the gold standard of musical cinema. Films like Top Hat, 1935, Swing Time, 1936, and Shall We Dance, 1937, lifted audiences out of Depression-era despair into a dream world of elegance and rhythm. On screen, they were perfection. Two bodies moving as one, laughter dissolving into longing, steps transforming into emotion. But behind the glamour, it was never effortless. Ginger rehearsed until her feet bled, her shoes soaked with quiet suffering the public would never see. Fred was known for his precision. Ginger matched it with pure emotional intelligence. Where he calculated every turn, she felt every movement. Their dynamic wasn't harmony, it was collision. He represented control, she represented spirit. Their dances were not mere choreography, but metaphors for life's eternal tension, order and chaos, masculinity and femininity, discipline and fire. And every time she smiled for the camera, she hid the exhaustion of being both muse and machine. Hollywood adored the duo, but the industry rarely credited her artistry equally. Directors praised Fred as the genius, the innovator, as if Ginger's radiance was accidental. The press often described her as the charming partner, the beautiful counterpart. But behind those soft words lay an invisible cruelty, the denial of her creative contribution. Ginger fought quietly but fiercely to be seen as more than half of a pair. And in her silence, she carried the pain of every woman whose brilliance was softened to flatter a man's ego. Yet, even in that struggle, she carved immortality. Her expression in The Way You Look Tonight, her poise in Top Hat, her bittersweet longing in Swing Time. These were not performances, they were revelations. Audiences didn't know it, but they weren't just watching a dancer. They were witnessing a survivor, translating years of restraint into grace. Her breakthrough wasn't just cinematic, it was personal. With every step, she reclaimed power over her body, her image, her destiny. But with each success came a growing emptiness, a whisper she couldn't silence. If I stop dancing, will I still matter? Hollywood would immortalize her elegance, but Ginger Rogers' greatest act was not on the dance floor. It was in her ability to hide pain beneath rhythm, to turn personal silence into universal beauty. The dance that changed everything gave her the world's adoration, but also chained her to it. Because from that moment on, Ginger was no longer the Junior Macbeth. She was a symbol, an icon, a fantasy of perfection. And behind that perfection, she would live the rest of her life trying to prove that she was real.
Peak career and achievements. The golden glow and the hidden cracks. By the mid-1930s, Ginger Rogers had ascended to a place few could ever reach, the shimmering pinnacle of Hollywood's golden age. She was elegance wrapped in sunlight, resilience disguised as charm. Her image, framed in soft focus and haloed by studio light, was the embodiment of American grace. To millions still reeling from the Great Depression, she wasn't merely an entertainer. She was a promise, proof that beauty and perseverance could still exist in a fractured world. With Fred Astaire, she'd already danced into cinematic legend, but Ginger was determined not to remain anyone's accessory, even one attached to a genius. Hollywood adored their pairing, yet behind the studio doors, she could feel her individuality fading beneath the synchronized perfection. When the lights dimmed and the applause faded, she often sat alone, wondering if her laughter belonged to her anymore, or to the character the world demanded her to be. It was around this time she began her quiet rebellion. She pushed for roles that revealed her dramatic depth, demanding scripts that challenged the perception of her as merely the dancer. When she took on Kitty Foyle in 1940, the story of a working woman's strength, heartbreak, and dignity, the performance became her declaration of independence. And when the Academy awarded her the Oscar for Best Actress, Ginger didn't just hold a golden statue, she held vindication. It was proof that her talent extended beyond rhythm and grace, that she could command hearts, even without a dance step. But success is never pure in Hollywood. It's laced with envy, politics, and loneliness. As her fame grew, so did the invisible distance between her and those around her. Directors respected her. Studios feared her resolve. She had become a woman who spoke her mind in an era that punished women for doing so. When she questioned pay inequality or demanded fair treatment, she was branded difficult. Her independence, the very quality that made her great, became the weapon used against her. Behind the camera's glow, the reality was far more fragile. The endless hours under hot lights, the rehearsals that tore her feet, the emotional fatigue of living as a public dream, it all began to erode something inside her. Friends recalled how Ginger would laugh on set, her humor filling the room, only to retreat afterwards into silence. She often wrote in her diary about the ache of existing between two worlds, the fantasy Hollywood built for her, and the solitude that waited when the camera stopped rolling. Still, she worked tirelessly, starring in over 70 films, from Stage Door and Bachelor Mother to Roxy Hart and The Major and the Minor. Each role revealed another shade of her complexity, sometimes comedic, sometimes sorrowful, always human. She had the rare gift of embodying women who were both strong and breakable, clever yet tender, fierce but yearning for love. Audiences saw themselves in her contradictions, her beauty laced with imperfection. But fame, like dance, has its rhythm and its exhaustion. By the late 1940s, the Hollywood she had conquered began to change. Younger stars emerged, new styles overtook the golden musicals, and the world's tastes shifted towards realism. For Ginger, who had built her legacy on glamour and motion, it felt like the earth was slowly pulling the stage out from under her. Her on-screen image, the witty, radiant woman who could glide across marble floors and command every gaze, began to feel like a haunting mirror of what she could no longer sustain. The world adored her smile, but Ginger herself had grown weary of performing happiness. She confessed in later interviews that despite her fame, she often felt unseen, a woman loved for her shadow, not her soul. And yet, even as her star began to fade from its brightest glow, her influence deepened. She had transformed what it meant to be a female performer in Hollywood. She'd proven that charm could coexist with intellect, that femininity could be power, that grace could also be defiance. Her characters embodied the women America was becoming, independent, brave, unwilling to be defined by a man's script. But inside the triumphs, the cracks widened. Relationships faltered. Love seemed to drift away as easily as it came. She married and divorced several times, her heart always searching for an anchor that fame could never provide. The applause that once felt like validation now echoed like emptiness. She had built an empire of beauty and resilience, but every empire, even one built on rhythm and light, hides a certain sorrow. By the time she looked back on her career, she could see both the brilliance and the burden of her legacy. She had danced her way into immortality, but the price was motion itself. To stop moving meant to feel the stillness, to face the silence she had avoided for decades. And so she kept dancing, smiling, performing, even as her heart longed for something quieter. Her golden years were radiant, yes, but beneath that radiance lived the truth of every legend, that fame may crown the body, but it leaves the soul yearning for peace.
Personal life and challenges, the heart behind the spotlight. Beneath the glimmer of Ginger Rogers' public persona, the sequined gowns, the effortless laughter, the timeless smile, lay a woman whose private world was far from the romantic musicals that made her a legend. She was the embodiment of grace on screen,
But behind that poise was a heart marked by solitude, heartbreak, and the unrelenting demand to remain perfect in a world that devoured imperfection. Ginger was born with a spirit that refused to break, yet life seemed determined to test its limits. Her romantic history alone reads like a map of longing and disappointment. She married 5 times, searching in each man for the stability and warmth that fame could never give her. But fame has a cruel way of poisoning love. Every embrace came under the shadow of her reputation, every relationship threatened by jealousy or imbalance. Her first marriage to Jack Culpepper, a vaudeville performer, began in youth and chaos, 2 dreamers clinging to each other while chasing separate lights. It ended as quietly as it began, a reminder that love could flicker out even before it fully glowed. Her later marriages to actors, producers, and businessmen offered moments of joy, but no lasting refuge. Ginger wanted what few in Hollywood could have, a simple, enduring connection, a home untouched by cameras and expectations. But every time she came close, the demands of her career intruded. Late-night shoots replaced dinner conversations. Fan mail and headlines replaced intimacy. She would later confess in interviews that her greatest loneliness often came not when she was alone, but when she was surrounded by people applauding her. Still, she carried herself with dignity. She refused to let heartbreak define her, at least publicly. Yet her diaries and letters, glimpses into her inner world, revealed a woman who often questioned whether she was loved for who she truly was or merely for who she appeared to be. "They see the dancer," she once wrote, "but they never ask if the dancer's feet hurt." That line, so tender and painful, captured the quiet ache of her existence, the exhaustion hidden behind grace, the endurance behind elegance. Her relationship with her mother, Leela Rogers, was both a source of strength and a haunting shadow. Leela was a journalist and strong-willed woman who had been Ginger's earliest guide, a mother who fiercely protected and pushed her daughter toward greatness. It was Leela who shaped Ginger's ambition, teaching her to navigate a male-dominated industry with wit and resilience. But as the years went on, that same influence grew suffocating. The line between guidance and control blurred. There were times when Ginger's success felt like a shared burden, not a shared victory. The 2 women loved each other deeply, but their relationship was often strained by expectation, pride, and the invisible weight of mutual dependence. And then there were the insecurities, the kind that even Oscar winners carry. Ginger was acutely aware of Hollywood's obsession with youth. The industry that once celebrated her vitality began whispering about her age as the decades passed. She fought to find roles that honored her maturity rather than punish it. Each rejection chipped away at her sense of worth, forcing her to confront the reality that in Hollywood, brilliance had an expiration date. For a woman who had once commanded the screen, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. She turned to faith for solace, embracing Christianity with a fervor that surprised many of her peers. It gave her structure, something stable in a world built on illusion. But even faith couldn't erase the melancholy of watching her world change, of seeing the glamour she once defined turn into nostalgia. She began retreating from the industry, seeking comfort in her home in Oregon, where she surrounded herself with nature, her writings, and memories of a world that no longer existed. Despite her fame, she often spoke about feeling invisible. Friends recalled how Ginger, in her later years, would host small gatherings, elegant, quiet affairs, where she would laugh and reminisce, her charm undimmed. But sometimes, as the laughter faded, her eyes would grow distant. It was as if she were listening to an echo from another lifetime, the applause that once defined her, now replaced by silence.
Behind every photograph, every performance, every flawless spin on the dance floor was a woman who longed for stillness. Ginger's tragedy wasn't scandal or destruction. It was the quiet heartbreak of being loved by the world, but misunderstood it by it. She lived for others' joy, even when her own had dimmed. The world remembers her grace, but few saw the tears she held behind her lashes, the loneliness that crept into the edges of her golden smile. And yet, through every broken heart and fading spotlight, she never lost her dignity. She remained graceful even in grief, strong even in isolation. Her story reminds us that the greatest performers aren't those who escape pain, but those who carry it silently and still make the world believe in beauty.
Later years. Decline. When the music stopped dancing. As the golden lights of Hollywood's golden age dimmed, so too did the rhythm of Ginger Rogers' once unbreakable dance. The 1950s and 1960s were decades of change, and while new stars rose with modern styles and fresh faces, Ginger, once the embodiment of charm, wit, and motion, found herself standing still in a world that had forgotten how to waltz. Her fame had been built on elegance, discipline, and a kind of romantic optimism that no longer fit the restless pulse of a new generation. The cinematic dream was shifting, and for the first time in her life, Ginger was watching it from the outside. It began subtly, almost invisibly. The scripts that once came in overflowing stacks began to thin out. Directors who had once begged for her presence now called less often, replaced by new names, new tastes, new styles of storytelling that didn't have room for her grace. Hollywood's cruelest truth is that it remembers youth longer than it remembers excellence. Ginger, once a symbol of the modern woman, independent, witty, strong, was being quietly replaced by another generation of new faces. It wasn't her talent that had faded, it was the world's attention. For someone who had lived her life through applause, the silence that followed was deafening. She tried to reinvent herself, taking to Broadway and television, proving again that she was far more than just a dancer in Fred Astaire's shadow. In 1965, she starred in Hello, Dolly on stage and received standing ovations, proof that the fire still burned within her. But the cheers of live theater, though sincere, could not fill the growing hollow that Hollywood's absence left behind. It was as if the city that had once crowned her had quietly exiled her. Her mother, Leela Rogers, grew older, frailer. The bond that had defined so much of Ginger's emotional life began to shift as Ginger herself took on the role of caretaker. Leela's death in 1977 struck her like an earthquake. The woman who had guided, pushed, and even haunted her was gone, leaving behind not just grief, but an overwhelming silence. Ginger described that loss as losing the mirror of my life. Without her mother, the stage lights seemed colder, the world less vivid. She retreated more deeply into privacy, seeking comfort in her Oregon home, far away from the noise of Los Angeles. There she lived surrounded by relics of her past, the gleaming trophies, yellowed movie posters, satin dresses carefully folded away in cedar chests. Each artifact was a reminder of what once was, and each carried a whisper of a life that could never return. Sometimes visitors would find her walking along the forest paths near her home, humming softly to herself, perhaps an echo of a tune she once danced to, perhaps a memory too tender to speak aloud. The press would occasionally attempt to pull her back into the public eye. Interviews, tributes, retrospectives. She always appeared dignified, her posture perfect, her tone gracious. But those who knew her well noticed the distance in her eyes, the faint melancholy that lingered behind her practiced smiles. Ginger had become a symbol of a bygone era,
loved, admired, but no longer seen. Her health began to falter in the 1980s. The dancer's body that once defied gravity now carried the weight of years. Arthritis stiffened her movements, the same feet that once glided across polished floors, now trembling with pain. Still, she never allowed pity. When asked in an interview how she felt about aging, she simply smiled and said, "It's like a dance. You keep moving until the music stops." It was a beautiful sentiment, but those close to her knew the truth. She missed the stage. She missed the rhythm of creation, the electricity of being alive in front of an audience. She missed being needed. As television began rediscovering the golden stars of the past, she received Lifetime Achievement Awards and tributes. The applause returned, but it was different now, gentler, more nostalgic, as though the world were clapping not for the woman standing before them, but for the ghost of who she had been. And Ginger, ever the professional, accepted it with grace, even as her heart ached with a bittersweet truth. The music had changed, but she still danced to her own rhythm, even if only in memory. In her final years, she wrote, painted, and kept journals. Friends spoke of her wisdom and humor, her surprising gentleness, and her ability to recall every detail of her past with photographic clarity. But beneath those recollections lay something unsaid, a deep loneliness that fame could never fill. She once confided to a friend, "The hardest thing isn't growing old. It's realizing the world doesn't remember the way you danced." Ginger Rogers passed away in 1995 at the age of 83. The world mourned the loss of an icon, but for those who understood her story, her death marked something more profound, the final step of a dance that had never truly ended. Her life had been choreographed by both triumph and tragedy, her movements etched forever into the silver screen. Yet even in death, one could almost imagine her spinning gracefully into the light, poised, radiant, eternal. Because, for Ginger Rogers, the music never truly stopped. It just became quieter, gentler, fading into the echoes of memory, where she would dance forever.
Legacy and symbolism. The woman who danced through time. Long after the last curtain had fallen and the world's cameras turned to new faces, Ginger Rogers' legacy continued to move, like a melody that refuses to end. Her name, shimmering in black and white reels, became more than a credit in the golden archives of cinema. It became a symbol of endurance, of grace under pressure, and of the eternal human struggle to stay radiant even as the spotlight fades. For decades, she had been half of one of Hollywood's most iconic duos, Fred and Ginger. Together, they had defined elegance, reshaped dance, and transformed film into visual poetry. But history, in its careless simplicity, often remembered the pair as a single unit, forgetting that Ginger was far more than a partner in motion. She was strength in silk gloves, fire behind a soft smile, and determination beneath sequined gowns. While Astaire choreographed precision, Ginger choreographed emotion. She brought heart to the dance, giving it weight, warmth, and vulnerability. Her legacy, however, was not confined to the stage or screen. In many ways, Ginger represented a transformation of womanhood itself in early Hollywood, a time when female power was often masked behind charm. She embodied independence, not rebellion, class, not compliance. She navigated a world dominated by powerful studios and male directors, refusing to be reduced to the dancer next to Fred. When she won the Academy Award for Kitty Foyle in 1941, she shattered that image, proving that she could carry an entire story on her own shoulders. The victory wasn't just professional, it was symbolic. It said, "I am more than the rhythm you remember." You could see her influence ripple outward through generations of women who came after. Actresses like Meryl Streep, Nicole Kidman, and Michelle Williams all carry pieces of that strength, the ability to blend vulnerability with steel. Modern filmmakers still study her timing, her expressions, the way she could make silence speak louder than dialogue. She turned movement into storytelling, and storytelling into something sacred. But her legacy also carries a haunting undercurrent, a cautionary tale about fame's fleeting nature. For every young performer who rises in brilliance, Ginger's life whispers a warning. Even the brightest lights cast the longest shadows. Her struggle to be recognized beyond her partnership, her battles with loneliness and time, her retreat into memory, all of it reflects a deeper truth about what it means to give your life to art. To this day, film historians and dance lovers speak with reverence of her. When the American Film Institute listed the greatest female screen legends, Ginger Rogers was there, not just as a dancer, but as a woman who defined an era. Museums preserve her gowns, her shoes, her handwritten notes. And when you watch one of her films, when she spins across the floor in Top Hat or Swing Time, there's a moment, a flicker, where the illusion feels real again and you believe she might still be dancing somewhere. In a way, she is. Every time a young woman steps into a world that doubts her, every time she fights to be seen for more than her role beside someone else, Ginger's spirit moves again, elegant, determined, undefeated. She represents something far more timeless than Hollywood glamour. She represents the grace to survive, the courage to transform pain into performance, and the quiet dignity of never letting the world see you break. Ginger Rogers didn't just dance through time, she danced with it, through heartbreak, through change, through fading fame, and somehow emerged not as a relic, but as a reminder that beauty doesn't die, that strength can be gentle, and that sometimes the most powerful performances happen when no one is watching.
Closing statement: The Last Dance. Ginger Rogers' story is not merely one of glitter and grace. It is the story of what happens when the music fades, but the spirit refuses to stop moving. Her life mirrors the heartbeat of every artist who ever lived, between light and shadow, celebrated for what the world could see and haunted by what it could not. Behind the perfect twirls and radiant smiles lay a woman who carried her pain like choreography, controlled, concealed, and endlessly rehearsed. From a small-town girl in Independence, Missouri, to a woman whose name still glows in the constellation of Hollywood's immortals, her journey was both an ascent and a slow descent. A dance that began in joy and ended in quiet melancholy. She fought for respect, for identity, for love, and above all, for meaning. In the end, she found something that outlived her fame, legacy born of endurance. Her story teaches us something unspoken about the nature of brilliance, that it often comes with loneliness, that it demands sacrifice, and that even when applause stops, art continues to echo. The films she left behind are more than nostalgia. They are fragments of a dream that still breathes. Watch her glide across the screen, and you will see not just motion, but emotion. Not just choreography, but confession. When Ginger passed away in 1995, the world mourned politely,
as it does for old legends. But for those who truly understood her journey, her death felt like the closing of a curtain on an era that would never come again. A time when storytelling was rhythm, when elegance was truth, when the human soul could be captured in a single dance step. But perhaps that's how she would have wanted it. No fanfare, no spotlight, just the soft echo of her own footsteps fading into memory. In one of her final interviews, when asked if she missed the old days, she smiled faintly and said, "Oh, honey, I never stopped dancing. I just changed the stage." And maybe that's the truth of her life, that legends never really die. They simply find new music in the silence. Because somewhere beyond the flicker of time and film, Ginger Rogers is still dancing, gracefully, defiantly, in the eternal spotlight of memory.
The human lesson. Dancing with the ghosts of time. When the lights dim and the applause becomes a memory, what remains of a performer's life? For Ginger Rogers, that question lingered long after the final reel. She was more than a dancer, more than a screen idol. She was a woman who spent her life performing a delicate duet with time itself. Beneath the shimmer of satin and the rhythm of swing beats, she embodied something universal, the fragile balance between the self we present to the world and the one that trembles behind the curtain. The human lesson in Ginger's story lies not in her fame, but in her endurance. She taught the world that grace is not the absence of pain, it is the act of moving beautifully despite it. For decades she spun through heartbreak, aging, and invisibility with the same control she brought to the stage. She understood what few dared to confront, that the world's love is fleeting, but one's dignity must be eternal. She knew that glamour fades, applause stops, and the camera eventually turns away. But the way you carry yourself through that silence defines who you truly are. In a time when women were often treated as ornaments of their era, Ginger carved her place through poise and quiet rebellion. She smiled in a man's world without ever bowing to it. Every step, every smile, every perfectly rehearsed movement was both art and armor. It shielded her from the cold truth of Hollywood's impermanence. She understood the cost of being extraordinary, that to live in perfection on screen often means to live in fragments off it. And yet, she never became bitter. Even when roles disappeared and studios turned their backs, she continued to dance, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically. Her faith, her humor, and her resilience became her rhythm. The stages changed, from glittering sets to quiet living rooms, from movie premieres to private afternoons spent writing letters to friends. But the spirit never wavered. She lived with grace until the end, not as a star, but as a survivor. The tragedy of Ginger Rogers is not in her fall from fame, but in how invisible the cost of brilliance can be. Behind every perfect performance lies exhaustion, isolation, and the relentless demand to stay flawless. But the beauty of her legacy is that she never stopped trying, even when the world stopped watching.
That's what makes her story not just heartbreaking, but profoundly human. In the stillness of her later years, as she watched old films replaying moments of her youth, she once said, "The trick is not to stop dancing, even when there's no music left." That simple truth, poetic, humble, and devastating, captures the essence of her existence. For every soul who feels forgotten after their moment has passed, for every dreamer who fears the silence after success, Ginger's life is a mirror. She reminds us that meaning does not come from the crowd's applause, but from the courage to keep moving when no one is clapping. We live in a world obsessed with youth and novelty, where fame burns fast and fades faster. But Ginger's legacy whispers something deeper. It tells us that what matters most is not how bright you shine, but how gracefully you fade. That the art of living, like dancing, lies in knowing when to step forward and when to let go. So as her story comes to its quiet close, imagine her, not in sequins or spotlight, but standing alone on an empty stage, her silhouette framed by memory. The music fades, the world stills, and for a moment, time itself holds its breath. She takes one last bow, not for applause, but for peace. Because in the end, Ginger Rogers was never dancing for us. She was dancing to survive. And that unyielding grace in the face of time, is her final performance.